For this problem, it's called Kids Bake Them Cookies. It's a cookie problem, and it gives you a recipe that yields 24 cookies. The recipe has 1¼ cup of flour, 1/8 teaspoon of baking soda, 1/8 teaspoon of salt, a 1/2 cup of salted butter, a 1/2 cup of honey, a 1 cup of chocolate chips, a 1/4 cup of white sugar, and then it just tells you how to make the recipe. It says to mix flour, soda, and salt in a bowl, mix butter, sugar, and honey in a separate bowl, add the flour mixture and chocolate chips to this bowl, and bake at 300 for 18 to 20 minutes. Then the question says, it is Saturday afternoon, and you have decided to bake some cookies. The recipe that you have makes 24 cookies. So makes 24 cookies. These ingredients here. And then it says, but you only want to make 12. Figure out how much of each ingredient is needed for preparing the recipe for only half of the servings. Explain how you arrived at your answers, and then rewrite the recipe for that number of servings so that you and your family members can use the adjusted recipe in the future. So this is what it gave us. And then next I would look at what is the question asking us? Well, it's asking us that we only want, and telling us we only want to make 12 cookies instead of 24. So we have to figure out how much of each ingredient we need to only make half of this recipe. So how much of each ingredient do we need to make 12 cookies? That's what it's asking us to do. Then it's saying explain how we arrived at our answer. And then last it says to rewrite the recipe rewrite an adjusted recipe for only making 12 cookies. So that's what it gave us up here, and this is what it's asking us to do. So now, what do we do? How do we solve it? So one way that I could see to solve this that I don't really have the materials for would be to use fraction blocks or fraction, fraction bars. Another way that you could answer this problem would be to draw it out. So you could, for example, for a 1/2 cup of butter, like we have right here, you could draw a whole bar Make sure that all of your holes are the same size though, otherwise it could be very confusing. This is one hole, 1 cup, 1 hole. And the original recipe asks for 1/2 cup. So the original recipe wants 1/2 cup. 1/2 of it. So if you want to cut it in half, because first you have to know that 12 is 1/2 of 24. You have to reason through that. So what you're doing, what students need to mathematically reason and figure out is that you're actually halving all of these ingredients. You're dividing them by 2. And they need to understand that relationship between 1/2 and then dividing these fractions by 2. So if you have 1/2 cup of butter here, you need to divide it in half. So if you're dividing the half in half, and if you divided this half in half, your whole now is made up of 4 pieces. But you only need one of these pieces, one of this half, which is 1/4 of the cup. So you would end up needing for your new recipe a 1/4 cup of butter. So you could do this for every single ingredient up here for the flour, the baking soda, the salt. Make diagrams of it or use fraction blocks and then actually physically divide them in half. Or you could use numbers and just divide your fractions through standard algorithms. So what you could do is you could let's take your 1/8 teaspoon of baking soda. So you have 1/8 teaspoon of baking soda and you need to divide it by 2 because halving something is the same as dividing it by 2. What this actually looks like is 1/8 divided by 2/1. This makes it easier for us to look at and to visualize, and 2/1 or anything over 1 is just that whole number. So then what you do to divide this numerically or for the algorithm, a little saying that kids remember for dividing fractions is keep, change, flip. So you keep the first one, the 1/8, you change the sign to multiplication and you flip the second fraction, so now it's 1/2. And dividing by 2 is the same as multiplying by 1/2. And if kids already know that and they start at this step, that could be another solution path as well, a quicker one. And then you just multiply it out. 1 times 1 is 1, 8 times 2 is 16. So your answer, at least for that ingredient, is up here. 1/8 teaspoon of salt is now 1/16 teaspoon of salt. So you can do that for all of them, for the rest of them. 1 1/4 will be a tricky one because you need to, at least if you're dividing or multiplying numerically like we did here, kids are gonna have to know to change that mixed number into an improper fraction. You would end up getting 5/4. That's what it is as an improper fraction, and then multiplying it by 1/2 to get 5/8. So you need 5/8 cup of flour. There, 1/8 we already did, so that's 1/16. 1/2 times another 1/2, you'd get, this is 1/2 too, so you'd know that this is 1/4. 1 divided by 2 would just be 1/2 for this one. And then this last one, 1/4, would go to 1/8. So students would just have to rewrite this fully, to rewrite the recipe for for making half the amount of cookies or 12 cookies, and then to explain, because it asks to explain how you arrived at your answers, students would just have to explain whatever solution path they took. Whether they used the fraction bars, whether they divided, or whether they knew that dividing by 2 was the same as multiplying by 1/2, so they multiplied. Whatever solution that the students took, they would just have to explain how they arrived at these answers so that they could justify their solutions.